welcome to the 20th Mahatma Gandhi Lecture on Nonviolence, hosted by the Center for Peace Studies and the Peace Studies program at McMaster University. I am Chandrima Chakravarti. I am the director of the Center for Peace Studies and the Peace Studies program, and I'm delighted to welcome you on this special occasion. I would like to begin by acknowledging that McMaster University is located on the traditional territories of the Mississauga and Haudenosaunee nations and within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. The dish with one spoon implies that we all eat out of the dish. That is, all of us share this territory, this land, with only one spoon. We are asked to share the responsibility of ensuring then that the dish is never empty, which requires taking care of the land and those who we share it with. Each of us have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respectful coexistence. As we gather here today in the midst of a global pandemic, it reminds us more than ever how each of our well-being is tied to that of others. How the relations of friendship, respect, and care that we develop with and for each other lays the foundation for the creation of just and peaceful living conditions. We are reminded of our interdependence on each other so that each of us can be well and so that we can live well together. The global pandemic has also made starkly visible the existing inequities in our societies. And in support with the Black Lives Matter movement, the Gandhi Lecture Committee decided to invite two living icons of our times to speak to Gandhi's legacies in relation to the civil rights movement and Black Lives Matter. But before I introduce you to our two esteemed speakers, Reverend James M, Honorable Dr. Jean Augustine, I would like to welcome our Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, Dr. Pamela Sweat, to say a few words of welcome. Pamela.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for what is the 20th Annual Mahatma Gandhi Lecture on Nonviolence. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you on this important anniversary. Organized, as Dr. Chakrabarti said, by McMaster's Center for Peace Studies, the Gandhi Lecture on Nonviolence was established to make the value and strategies of nonviolence widely known, and to develop the concept and practice of nonviolence through intellectual analysis, criticism, dialogue, debate, and experimentation. For those listening who are new to this event, I also want to mention that the lectureship is funded by many in the audience today and other friends of the faculty, a testimony to the engagement and vitality of the Indo-Canadian community, as well as the wider Hamilton community of peace and human rights activists, community organizations, and McMaster faculty and students. Thank you to all of those who have contributed to this lectureship for their continued support. This year's lecture focuses on Black Lives Matter, a rallying cry, a call to action, a movement even, a transnational movement. Our speakers, Reverend Lawson and Dr. Augustine, are leaders in the pursuit of social justice through nonviolence, and their words today, I am certain, will hold important lessons for us all. Thank you both to them for being here with us. As Dean of the Faculty, I feel privileged to be here as well and to work with Dr. Chakrabarti and the students in our Peace Studies program. Their commitment to understanding and promoting peace, nonviolence, and conflict resolution is unwavering. They give me confidence that the voices and actions of those committed to social and racial justice are getting louder and having ever greater impact. I now invite Chandrima to introduce our speakers, our first speaker. Thank you all again, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Pamela. As you just heard, the Gandhi Lecture is an annual event on McMaster campus, and each year we invite a respected analyst or practitioner of nonviolence to deliver in the interest of a community audience. Since this year's lecture is being held in an online format, those of you who have been attending the lecture series regularly will notice that we have two speakers this year. And the Gandhi Lecture Committee decided to do so as a way of facilitating and engaging conversation and to somewhat, mitigate the isolation of a virtual gathering. So each of our speakers will speak for about 20 to 30 minutes. I will introduce each speaker before they speak. And after both speakers have finished speaking, we will take questions. So please post your questions on the chat or please email it to me. You have my email on the poster. It's also there on the chat. It's chandri@mcmaster.ca. So now I will introduce our first speaker, Reverend James M. Lawson Jr. So Reverend James M. Lawson Jr. was born in Pennsylvania in 1928. His father and grandfather were Methodist ministers, and Reverend Lawson received his local preacher's license the year he graduated from high school. At his Methodist college in Ohio, in his freshman year, Reverend Lawson read Mahatma Gandhi's autobiography and was deeply influenced by it. He soon joined the Fellowship of Reconciliation, America's oldest pacifist organization. In 1948, Reverend Lawson refused to cooperate with the Korean War draft and was arrested. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. He was released after 13 months and then he obtained his BA in 1953. He spent next 3 years in India, in a college in Kanpur, where he went as a physical ed teacher and as campus minister. While in India, he deepened his study of Mahatma Gandhi's use of nonviolence to achieve social and political change. When he returned to the United States in 1956, he enrolled in Oberlin School of Theology in Ohio. Lawson encountered Martin Luther King at Oberlin College, Ohio, on February 6, 1956, where he was studying, and where King was speaking. King urged Lawson to move to the South, realizing the need for a second major nonviolent campaign after the Montgomery bus. Lawson transferred to Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee, and he began organizing the campaign to desegregate downtown Nashville. This became a model movement with more than hundreds of cities in the South following suit, and the desegregation of public space became a major strategy of nonviolent movement in the US. In 1968, at Reverend Lawson's request, Martin Luther King traveled to Memphis, Tennessee to draw attention to the plight of striking sanitation workers in the city. It was during this campaign that King was assassinated on 4th April 1968. On the eve of his assassination, King called Lawson, I quote, the leading theorist and strategist of nonviolence in the world, end quote. Reverend Lawson continued to work with various civil rights groups following King's assassination and trained civil rights activists in nonviolence. He's pastor emeritus at the Holman United Methodist Church in Los Angeles, a congregation he led for more than 25 years. He has been teaching courses on nonviolence at UCLA for the last 18 years. He has more than 25 honorary doctorates. He's in the Hall of Fame in California, and he continues to train activists, resist injustice, and fight for social injustice to this day. What an honor and a privilege, Reverend Lawson, to have you in our midst. Thank you for joining us today, and now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And you should recognize that the pleasure and honor are also mine because of your McMaster's University and because you're located in Toronto. I will describe this a little bit more. I have deep roots in Canada. My father, at a very early age, probably not more than 11, escaped with his father, we think, as slaves from colony of Virginia, around 1840. And they settled in what in Canada used to be called the Queen's Bush area, where my grandfather and his father were able to build apparently a very effective family farm. Until the 1970s, that farm was still in the hands of the Lawson family of Canada. Dad was born in Guelph, Ontario. In Allentown, Ontario, there is a historic plaque which lists the Lawson families that moved into Canada in that area in the 19th century. Apparently, my father, at a very early age, decided he was going to be a citizen of the United States. So around World War II, he moved in the United States and became a citizen here and carried out his ministry here for maybe 30, 40, 50 years. I have not figured it out. So I have Canadian emotions, and Canadian feelings, and Canadian ambitions, and I therefore want to warn Canada that you're part of Western civilization, and Western civilization has largely shaped the world today as we know it and see it, and has done this with a vigorous, overwhelming power that has not yet been reprimanded. From my perspective, that is. Western civilization powers that, in fact, have created the year 2020 and in our world, and that our election yesterday, or Tuesday rather, represents the great fragility in our Western civilization approach to life that needs yet to be corrected. I have to admit, as one who's watched my society since 1942 through reading and study and travel, I was frankly surprised that Donald Trump received 8 million more votes than he received in 2016. I did not expect that. I'm not sure what all that means. I'm buffaloed in some ways by it. It's going to take a lot of conversation and thought and study to come out of it. But he received 8 million more votes than he received in 2016. What does that say about the 70 million people who voted for him? And this would be different if Donald Trump was a non-public figure who suddenly emerged. He's been very much a public figure in Manhattan, New York, all his life. The civil rights suits against him as far back as in the 1970s because of segregation in their apartment buildings and office buildings. The civil rights suits, the effort on the part of the federal government make him conform to civil rights measures, namely non-discriminatory measures across the board. His womanizing male chauvinism that was outrageous, often in the entertainment world in the 60s and the 70s. He's not a stranger in that field of human sexuality, male chauvinism, male power, male domination, male creating what some scholars call the first oppression, the oppression of women, the subjugation of female Homo sapiens as a social, political, economic conquest issue. Therefore, is very much alive. His support of verbal violence as well as physical violence. So I want to remind my friends in Canada, my sisters and brothers in Canada, that Hitler was elected to office in Germany in 1932. So it's quite possible that's a Western model that we need to pay attention to. The vote, of course, is a nonviolent tactic or method of social, political, economic, personal change. It's in the literature that is now being gathered at the end of the 20th century mostly. It's one of the more than 200 methodologies of nonviolent or soul force struggle. So we have to understand that, and Gandhi understood that the vote is a methodology of nonviolent change that requires nonviolent theoretical and characteristic context to make it work. In other words, in the States, we'll have great numbers of people saying that we are enemies. What does that enemy mean? Is an enemy that can do the final solutions that the Nazi governments of Europe, of Germany did? The eradication, bold execution of 26 million people, 6 million Jews, but lots of Christians, lots of communists, lots of socialist people and whatnot, and gay and homosexual people. And then that 26 million that was deliberately murdered, executed is the better word for it, in that period of World War II. So I lay out this caution that maybe that's the model we should be working on, not Saudi Arabia, not Modi of India. We should be thinking about whether or not the model that will dictate to the United States of the future is a model of an election producing the tyrant. So that 8 million more votes, which I want to lift up, because that 70 million votes is extremely dangerous for the future of my country, therefore the future of Canada and the future of the world. And this is a warning sign. I don't know how you can figure this out, but it shows how, in the United States at least, we have not enabled our 330 odd million people to sense the power either of the Declaration of Independence or the visions and dreams of the preamble of our Constitution. We have done a very, very poor job of helping people see that the Constitution begins in the United States. We, the people of the United States of America. And what that means about our own personal conversion in the country. So my introduction has now changed, because I didn't even consider the election as I was thinking of this lecture. But I am delighted to have the chance to visit with you and talk with you about nonviolence, about Gandhi in particular. So the first major point I want to make is this, that our world has been shaped in the last 120 years or so, especially last 220 years, by two interventions in the 20th century. One intervention that was eagerly acknowledged and accepted and explored, investigated, studied, many books about it, and then applied all over the world. That is the intervention in the early 20s by Albert Einstein and the equations on relativity and gravity. A critical intervention which scientists all over the world seized and studied and examined and did major laboratory work on. and allowed for science to break into great power in the 20th century as a source of truth and as a source of verifying truth, helping us human beings to re-examine and to, in a sense, re-know. I'm going to use that word deliberately. Re-know, re-understand life in our universe, in our galaxy, and in our own specific continents and nations. Overwhelming contribution that in many ways have made life better for literally millions and millions of people, have taught us how to work better, among other things, to reject untruth and to reaffirm truth, beauty, and wonder. So probably no intervention like the Albert Einstein interventions in human history. But I want to also then propose that the second most important intervention in the 20th century to the world is by Mohandas K. Gandhi and his experiment with truth, his experiment with soul force, his experiment with what he called the most creative force of the universe. Because in large measure, Western civilization has laid out the principle that the great power for change is the power of violence. Gandhi insists that the greatest power of the universe, the force more powerful, in his words, is the force that we have not yet really brought into the mainstream of human thinking, namely the creative energy of the universe that created life. The power of creation, the power of love and truth, the power of compassion. And Gandhi goes on in his writings in different places and in different ways, saying that the human frame, the human mind, the human spirit, we of the human race have not yet even begun to explore the force of life as we know it. And he also insists that if we ever began to really work on using and applying the force of life, we would be astonished at the kind of world, the kind of nation, the kind of families we could create. And so I want to explore very quickly and very briefly the Gandhian alternative, because there's no way towards a world where all our inhabitants are seen as human beings. There's no way to that except through soul force and nonviolent struggle. And perhaps the way I would like to entertain this is to do a contrast with a historical experience in the 20th century that is still causing an awakening in the United States. And that is December 1, 1955, when Rosa Parks would not get up to allow a white man to sit in her seat. The seat in the bus in Montgomery, Alabama, had 4 black people in it. The bus was completely full. A white man got on the bus, and the driver came back to tell these 4 Negroes in that row of seats of 4, they must get up and move to the back of the bus. and 3 of the Negroes got up. But the 4th one, who was against the window seat, in a window seat rather, Rosa Parks refused to get up. And so you know the story, that she was arrested immediately and booked for violation of the segregation law, being a disturbance in the public. And that was the flame that allowed black folk in Montgomery, especially some very astute and wonderful black women, Louise West and Johnny Carr and Mary Jo Robinson especially. It allowed them to swing into action and to call for, in fact, a bus boycott, call for the use of a nonviolent tactic. And then that afternoon, Monday afternoon, this was a Friday, but Monday afternoon was the first day for which the boycott was called. It was more than 90% effective, and they gathered black spokespeople from around the community, business people, medical people, clergy, educators, and the net result was they asked Martin Luther King Jr. to be the advocate, / they also meant chairman of the Montgomery Improvement Association, which was organized on that Monday afternoon. And King, that night, December the 5th, at the Holt Street Baptist Church, then immediately put the boycott within the context of the teachings of Jesus, which most Christians do not adhere to, which most Christians do not accept. And I speak as a pastor of some 45 years of ministry in the United Methodist Church. Martin King, in his remarks that evening, said something like this: "We're going to do this through Christian love." Imagine that. In other words, speaking to a exploited community of maybe 40 to 50,000 people, King makes his first major point that we are going to run this boycott, this struggle, to tell the bus company no, and to tell the city of Montgomery we reject the segregation and the mistreatment that we have received for too many decades. We're going to do this in a Christian love manner. We're not going to do it through hate. We're not going to do it through imitation. We're not going to do it by repeating the visions of segregated Montgomery. We're not going to do it through the vision of almost all the Southern senators who adhered strictly to the notion that segregation of the races, the impoverishment of black people, and therefore of the whole nation, must become the way of life of the nation. We're not going to do it that way. We're going to do it through Christian love. Then to make his point even better, King insisted, we're not going to go downtown and drag white people out of their homes and commit violence against them. That's the violence of racism that was going on, major form of it. Then he said, we're not going to go downtown and burn crosses in Montgomery. The burning cross was the sign of the KKK to intimidate all kinds of people against any kind of motion, a mood that challenge a segregated option that they wanted to become the option for the whole nation. Later on, Gandhi Martin King then uses a word, uses the phrase nonviolence. He does not use it December the 5th, he uses it January the 20th or so. Later on, he uses the term nonviolence. So that was not the introduction of the civil rights movement. And I want that to be clear, that in talking about Martin Luther King and nonviolence and Gandhian work in the nation, one must create very firm lines because words and descriptions are powerful. The civil rights movement is an umbrella term that has to include extraordinary campaigns. Civil rights movement does not describe the movement of 9 black students in Little Rock, Arkansas, who desegregated one of the fine public schools of the nation. Their ordeal of being verbally and physically assaulted for much of the year, their ordeal of having the governor of their state say they had no business being in that school, their ordeal of having the federal court saying only 9 of you Negro students can go, not the 85 who had applied, but 9 only. So to call that campaign of 9 people who had the courage to say, we'll go to school at Central High, and the ordeal they went through, to call that the civil rights movement is a misnomer. It must be called the Little Rock 9. A worldwide observed campaign of which 9 teenagers were at the front, were the focus. Therefore, one massive story that can be told and should be told separately within the framework of the civil rights movement. In the same way, therefore, I accept and acknowledge scholarship of Congressman John Lewis, who was the first one I heard call our campaign from which I'm going to date it, 1953 to 1973. He called the Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King campaign the nonviolent movement of America. I think that one has to say that it was probably the largest challenge that the Western world had ever seen that was in conflict with the Western value of violence and war and militarization, in conflict with the Western vision of some people being the source of cheap labor, an objection to the notion of plantation capitalism, which was the dominant economy that came out of Western civilization and remains the dominant economy in the United States. So I would frame the Gandhian movement in India, because Gandhi was the major source of many of our ideas, though it was in the spirit of Jesus that it was carried on. I had previous to this time studied Gandhi from 1947 to 1958. 10 years of studying nonviolence around the world, in the United States, in Africa, in Europe, in India, in Asia, and all. And knew by 1952 that we were going to have a movement in the United States that would change the face of the nation. I enlarged that King Rosa Parks nonviolent movement from 1953 to 1973. I won't go into great detail about it, but in that 20-year period, we had major nonviolent soul force campaigns that in fact went across the country, though nowhere in the depth with the organized structure as in the southeastern part of the country. But those campaigns, for example, included the Montgomery bus boycott, 1955, 1957, included the Albany campaign. I'm sorry, the second major campaign was the sit-in campaign, 1960. The third campaign was Freedom Ride, 1961. The second major, the fourth year major campaign was Albany, Georgia. And in each of these years, you had a place where the eyes of the world were focused, Albany, Georgia, Montgomery, Alabama. But then you had at the same time hundreds and hundreds of sympathy struggles across the United States. For example, in the 1963 Birmingham campaign, the Birmingham campaign produced the Washington March of 1963, August 28th. This is unknown because it's not in the history books, or that at least the history books I've read. I was in the meeting that called for the Washington March. I was in the meeting in April of 1963 in Birmingham campaign when we decided there should be a Washington March and instructed Dr. King on how to make it happen. Very specifically. And then we went back in our strategy meeting that Friday morning, which was Good Friday, which is how I remember it. We went back to then the struggles in Birmingham for that day and for that weekend for the next several weeks. So 1963, a major campaign in Birmingham, but there were campaigns all over the country. Now some of the scholarship tells me, though it has not yet been richly studied, that in the 60s there were more than 200 cities in the southeastern part of the country alone that had major desegregation campaigns of the downtown areas. I did not know it was that high until just maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago, as some of the studies are being performed. But I commend to you the fact that in the United States, a major campaign of nonviolence, 1953 to 1973, deeply rooted in Gandhian unpacking of soul force and of what nonviolence means, its methodology, its philosophies, and what it could do, was in the very heart of Western civilization, in the most powerful empire that human history had ever taught. It followed, I actually used a modified Gandhian methodology for the sit-in campaign, which introduced the Gandhian methodology for many of those cities that operated. I want to, so now this year, you have a major representation of it because between May and August, the Black Lives Matter strategy ignited demonstrations in all 50 states and Washington, D.C., more than 7,750 demonstrations at the last count in 2,400 locations across the country. So I'll just say that in. More than 7,750 demonstrations in more than 2,400 locations in all 50 states and DC, numbering, according to some of the studies that are just now being released and worked out, anywhere between 15 and 25 million people in those demonstrations. That number will be much larger. So that nonviolent movement of America, a major campaign effecting in the 21st century, a group of Black people who organize what they call Black Lives Matter. There are only 16 to maybe 30 at the most such networks in maybe only about 30 places at the very best. We don't know for sure yet. But they used a major strategic tactic. They surrounded the families from the time of the death of Martin in Florida. From that time, they surrounded the families with a ministry to their grief, enabling those families to grieve privately and personally and publicly, and to go after the heart of racism, namely the use of violence to protect and preserve a labor force in the United States. And I'm not being Marxist here, because Marx has very little relevancy, I think, to the United States. But they pushed very hard to maintain black people in a poverty position commensurate, it can be called, in fact, another name for slavery. That campaign is a part of the evolutionary process of a social movement, largely a nonviolent movement. Soul Force is a method and philosophy of social change, personal change, that can help people convert themselves where they have lost part of their own humanity because of racism or sexism or violence or plantation capitalism. Those four historical streams, with many subsections for each of them, have been the major shaper of USA economic and social and political and military policy for decades. All of them, racism, sexism, violence, plantation capitalism, teach that some human beings have not been created by God. Some segments of Homo sapiens are inferior. The KKK said, in fact, in the 1880s, KKK said that all people of color are mud people, created by a demagogue, not by the God of the Jewish Christian Bibles. So the point I'm making to you is that those entities that I've named teach people that some people are superior to others and other people are to be mistreated and dominated and kept in their place. The Black Lives Matters indicates the extent to which the nonviolent campaigns of the 20th century continue to advance our strategic agenda, which is, from the point of view of the Negro song in slavery, that every vestige of slavery must be vanquished and destroyed. So, and to allow, therefore, the space of human life and culture and development that is creatively full of compassion and justice and freedom for all, that is accessible for all. I just want to name that as the major element of what we have seen this year, 2020, in the United States. So to wrap it up, it is the intervention of Gandhi that has now also intervened in the life of Western civilization through the United States and through the black man, that nonviolence has become in many ways a term that we did not know before. Now the task, it seems to me, for those of us who want to see Gandhi exploited fully, is to help our cities, our nation, our Western civilization to discover that the future of violence is what we see in Syria, Liberia, and Libya, Central Asia, the Middle East. The future hope of the nations is in the pathway that Gandhi introduced as the greatest, most powerful force that we know. Through nonviolence is the way for truth and justice in the United States and Canada and in Europe. And if we are going to stop Trumpism in the United States, or in Hungary, or in Poland, or in other parts of Europe, it can only be done through the process of treating our enemies with a decency that they do not know. Through a nonviolent spirit, a compassionate political process that they do not know. It is through nonviolence that the awakening of Western civilization and of my own country towards the light can be enriched and empowered. Nonviolence intervention is slower, but it's the one can even teach science, that science in the use of the military of weaponry of destruction is not the wave of any meaningful, significant future. That soul force, God force, love force, truth force, beauty force are the contexts that we need for political and social, cultural development and work. That ends my remarks.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry I spoke over, Chandrima.
Absolutely fine. Thank
More
you.
than 20 minutes.
No, don't worry. That was great. Thank you. You gave us the context and the history, much of which, I at least didn't know. And it's good to have that, refresher course to sort of see how, where we were in the past and where we are, and sort of see the past in the present, as well as to sort of see some of the lineages of the past in the present. No, that's wonderful. Thank you. So now I will just go on to our next esteemed guest, the Honorable Jean Augustine. And Jean Augustine made history as the first Black woman elected to Canada's Parliament and served from 1993 to 2006. Her tenure included distinguished service as Parliamentary Secretary to the Prime Minister, Minister of State for Multiculturalism and the Status of Women, Chair of the International Trade Committee, and Deputy Speaker of Parliament. Her legislative successes include the historic Black History Month motion and the groundbreaking Famous Five motion, which authorized the first and still the only statues on Parliament Hill depicting women other than Queen Elizabeth. From 2007 to 2015, she served as Ontario's first ever Fairness Commissioner. In 2008, the Jean Augustine Chair in Education, Community and Diaspora was launched at York University to help advance education, equity, and inclusiveness. Also in her name are a Girls Leadership Academy in Scarborough, a Center for Young Women's Empowerment, and a municipal park in Etobicoke, a secondary school in Brampton, and a multi-purpose complex and district park in Vaughan. A member of the Order of Canada and Commander of the Order of the British Empire, Jean Augustine holds honorary doctorates from the universities of McGill, Toronto, York, Windsor, Waterloo, Guelph, and Trent. She supports scholarships at Centennial College, George Brown, and Humber College. Please join me in welcoming the Honorable Jean Augustine.
Thank you so much. I I'm just amazed by the presentation of Dr. Lawson, and I want to welcome him to Canada again. Dr. Sweet, the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities, professors and students and all the community who are part of this virtual today. I'm so very pleased that McMaster has, and the Center for Peace Studies has given me this opportunity to participate with you in this 20-year tradition. I want to acknowledge and thank the Reverend Lawson for not only the wonderful insight, but also the historical perspective that he's presented to us. Dr. King was right about you, Dr. Lawson, or Reverend Lawson. So we thank you for sharing. So yes, we are presenting today against a backdrop of such uncertainty and challenges, racial tension, disharmony, threats of violence, near and far. Our hearts are often broken by reports of senseless acts of terror and senseless killings. This negativity and consternation fills us with emotion. In some of us, it incites an instinctive urge to react. Mahatma Gandhi's example of peaceful, nonviolent protest remains evermore relevant today in the evolving context of Black Lives Matter in Canada. I was asked to give a perspective of the Canadian scene because Reverend Lawson has delineated for us the US context. We're told that Mahatma Gandhi did not have a set plan, that what it was instead was a vision and a hope that nonviolence could be a creative and moral way to conduct relationships, alleviate conflicts, and thus create change. It channels moral force, courage, and sacrifice in pursuit of greater goals. In Canada, it remains important in our continuing efforts to build a better society. I have seen change. You see, when I immigrated here from Grenada in 1960, I arrived in a land that at the time had no Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And it's a place like Toronto. We had no landlord and tenant legislation, no police community relations, and no parent education, school communication.
Mm-hmm.
There was no talk of diversity and inclusion and race relations and media representation. The workplace and the marketplace were not accommodating to immigrants. Like Gandhi, confronting the systems and institutions was the only way to create change, to make life better. The news carried the civil rights movement in the United States. We learned of Dr. King drawing from the writings of Gandhi to organize peaceful resistance. The graphic imagery of Black protesters being hounded, beaten, and brutalized by police evoked admiration for King and the nonviolence protesters across America and the world. I came to understand very early that I had to become the change I wanted to see in the world. I chose to become an activist, to work with others, to organize, to learn, and to follow the ideal of the nonviolent social change. The values of truth, nonviolence, harmony, morality, and simplicity were the foundation of Gandhi's numerous teachings. Out of those, there were several most relevant in the quest to build a better Canada in the 1960s. There were some principles that were relevant then and are relevant to us today. The first, I think, is the complete unity and integrity of body, mind, and soul. We have to be disciplined in our mind. It is a conscious awareness that is tied to a sense of moral purpose, which guides us to take useful and right action. The second principle that I want to affirm, the principle of Gandhian philosophy, furthers that all social action should be governed by the same simple set of moral values: selflessness, non-attachment, non-violence, active service. Gandhi judged the value and the vitality of social institutions by their capacity to foster such growth. The third principle is that no society, no state, no institution has any worth or importance except in contributing to the growth of the individuals of which it is composed. For example, the government or the police exist to truly serve the people. Fourthly, the means are as important, and we hear this all the time, that the ends have to be something good. Gandhi furthered that the ends never justifies the means. This implies the rejection of war or other dishonorable paths, even if being used for so-called noble ends, like defending a country or religion or humanity. And fifthly, Gandhi espoused that faith in God is the foundation of all moral values. But he never defined the God and understood that every person may have his or her own idea of God. It is important to add that respect for women is another major tenet of Gandhi's teachings. It is particularly significant that he took his stand during an era of normalized suppression and subjugation of women. All told, these principles are the bedrock of nonviolent resistance. By definition, it is a means to achieve targeted goals such as social change through symbolic protests, civil disobedience, economic or political non-cooperation while being non-violent. In action, it channels the desires of an individual or group that feels something needs to change to improve the current condition of the resisting person or group. And Dr. Lawson gave us some examples. And that is exactly how we felt in Toronto in those days. So in step with the civil rights movement in the US, we marched, we demonstrated, we walked, we conducted sit-ins, letter writing, providing evidence and testing practices of employers and landlords. And you know what? Lo and behold, here and there, change began to happen. I understood the power of meeting violence with non-violence, hatred with love, and oppression with love for the oppressor. I set important goals, and with good focus and a sound work ethic, I took action with others. In the summer of 1989, almost 30 years after I arrived in Canada, and coincidentally just over 30 years ago, I was able to fulfill a precious goal. With a group of Canadian activists, I spent 2 weeks at the Dr. Martin Luther King Center in Atlanta. There, we studied the theories and principles of nonviolent social action, starting with Mahatma Gandhi. I still cherish memories of interacting with Mrs. Coretta King and family, Andrew Young, and all the other allies in the struggle for racial and social justice who came to speak to us. We explored concepts of passive resistance, civil disobedience, non-cooperation, civil resistance. I returned to Toronto with the others, determined to make a difference. We set up newer goals, and I participated in deliberate action. In 1991, I chaired the largest conference in Toronto and in Canada, I think, to date, on social change and non-violence, the work of Gandhi and King. This conference brought together members of the Black community and East Indian communities to exchange on peace and social justice. We welcome individuals like Dr. S.P. Banerjee, the professor of philosophy at the University of Calcutta, Dr. Jitashree Banerjee, Dr. Danilo Dolci, the recipient of the 1988 Gandhi Peace Prize, and many speakers who were experts in the lessons of Gandhi and the King. We received funding from this Ministry of Citizenship and Culture at the time. After this exhilarating and energizing conference, I was now fully committed to peace and social justice causes. And in 1993, 2 years later, I became the first African Canadian Black woman elected to Canada's Parliament. Yes, do rest assured, systemic discrimination, racism, and other barriers lurked in every corner. But as you would imagine, the wisdom I brought empowered me to eventually bring about some necessary change to the new spaces to which I now had access. I was proud to lend my voice and vote time and again in support of legislation that would make a positive difference in the lives of many living in socio-economic difficult situations. I gained enormous or unanimous all-party consent to successfully pass a motion in Parliament which made Black History Month official across Canada. Later, I would again work to gain unanimous all-party support to pass a motion which would allow statues of women to be placed on Parliament Hill for the first time in the history of Canada. Meanwhile, around the world, nonviolent resistance had evolved to becoming a popular means to obtain necessary social change. As a matter of fact, from 1966 to 1999, nonviolent civic resistance played a critical role in about 50 to 67 transitions away from authoritarianism or authoritarian governments. In 1994, as an official election observer in South Africa, I was proud to witness the election of a follower of Gandhi's nonviolent resistance philosophy. President Nelson Mandela had held Mahatma Gandhi's principles through 27 years of incarceration under a brutal apartheid regime. In nearly all world instances, nonviolent resistors must face police. So in February 2003, as the Minister of Multiculturalism, I hosted a national forum on policing in a multicultural society. And this was the first national call to police and those involved in the judicial system. The participants came from law enforcement, ethnic and racial communities, academia, and public institutions. Discussion centered on three themes. One, recognizing and embracing diversity. Two, policing with a national security agenda at the forefront. Three, public participation, civilian oversight, and governance. The forum developed strategies and made recommendations. It strengthened partnerships between police and community across the country and shared tools and best practices. As a direct outcome, I announced the launch of the Law Enforcement and Aboriginal Diversity Network to foster a common professional approach that will help all police service in Canada better serve Aboriginal and racially diverse communities. The initiative was led by the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police. It also sought to ensure that law enforcement officers receive training and information on effective practices that will better prepare them to deliver bias-free policing services. But I will come back to this later. In 2006, I retired from the Parliament of Canada and took on several new public service roles, including as chair of the Ontario Bicentenary Commemorative Committee on the Abolition of the Slave Trade Act, and later 2007 as the province of Ontario's first Fairness Commissioner. It was not until 2012 that the notion of Black Lives Matter emerged in Canada as a grassroots response to the acquittal of the perpetrator in the shooting death of an innocent African-American teenager, Trayvon Martin. Drawing from the example of Gandhi, here in Toronto, we marched peacefully, calling for justice, no peace. In years since, the Black Lives Matter movement has organized street demonstrations, nonviolent protests, following incidents of questionable killing of unarmed Black persons by police officers. Ontario Human Rights Commission data illustrates that police violence and anti-Black attitudes also frame the Black experience in Canada. According to Black Lives Matter, that data demonstrates Toronto police are 20 times more likely to kill Black people than non-Black people. Based on these shared realities of systemic racism, anti-Blackness, and police violence perpetrated against Black people in Canada and the United States, Black Lives Matter chapters were established in a handful of Canadian cities. Today, the popularity of the message of Black Lives Matter has grown to new heights with active chapters in Toronto, Waterloo, Vancouver, and Fredericton. In July 2015, Black Lives Matter protesters shut down a Toronto street protesting the shooting deaths of 2 Black men by police. Later in September, Black Lives Matter activists shut down several other Toronto streets, citing police brutality, all nonviolent. An estimated 15 million to 26 million people of different backgrounds, creeds, races, gender, orientations, ages, and communities participated across the United States and in Canada, making Black Lives Matter one of the largest movements in US history. Many more people took to the streets around the world in solidarity with the protest around George Floyd's murder and the international attention that that received. In our Canadian streets, they called out for justice and pointed out anti-Black racism in Canada, racial profiling by police, daily microaggressions, systemic exclusion, and institutional silencing. They pointed out a series of documented incidents of police violence and killings, including several victims who had phoned for mental health assistance and ended up shot to death. Defund the police has also become a rallying cry across against police excessive force, with the money being invested directly into Black communities and alternative emergency response models. But one controversial area is Black Lives Matter call for the removal of statues or monuments which glorify historical wrongs, white supremacy, and colonialism. Ironically, earlier this year, there were calls on the campus of Carleton University in Ottawa to move a statue of Mahatma Gandhi himself. They allege that Mahatma Gandhi in his time was a racist. I know, Dr. Chakrabarty, that you were in Ottawa, and I applaud you for taking up the mantle to shed light on a narrative that was skewed towards Mahatma's early journey towards developing the seminal ideas about nonviolent resistance, peace, and justice. Yes, these ideals did shape the approach of Black leaders around the world, including, as I said, Nelson Mandela, Pan-Africanist Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia, and American civil rights activists like W.E.B. Du Bois. Dr. Martin Luther King heralded that the Gandhian philosophy of nonviolent resistance was the only morally and practically sound method open to oppressed people in their struggle to freedom. Still, in 2020, I remain of the utmost conviction that this is the most effective means through which we must continue our quest for social justice and equality in our communities and around the world. So what is our Canadian reality? According to a recent Canada-US border poll by the Innovative Research Group, the Black Lives Matter movement appears to have triggered a significant rise in people's regard for Black citizens in Canada. Today, I reflect on Gandhi's principles for social change. How can we respond to today's challenges using Gandhi's philosophy? How do we deal with escalating violence and terror, racial tension, cultural conflicts, populism, strong men leadership, and individualism? Where is the moral force, the courage, the sacrifice for ideals and beliefs to inspire us as we search for social justice and equality around the world? Gandhi's teachings offer us a choice to be active and resist violence and evil without being violent. I repeat, Mahatma did not have a set plan, we are told, but a vision and a hope that nonviolence could be a creative and moral way to conduct relationships, alleviate conflicts, and thus create change? Where is that moral leadership for a just social order? I grew up in Happy Hill, St. George's, Grenada, born in 1937. The global political landscape has dramatically changed in my lifetime. We are engaged now in multilateral issues, trading blocs, foreign and security concerns, cyber conflict, banking systems, ignoring environmental challenges and ignoring the lines that are drawn between the haves and the have-nots in our societies. I believe that never before have we lived in a world that faced a more complex or uncertain political climate. That is why the work of the Center for Peace Studies here at McMaster is so important. The world needs your academic leadership to empower fellow stakeholders to continue along the example of Gandhi to bring about the change we want to see in the world. When I introduced the motion in 1995, asking Parliament to designate February as Black History Month in Canada, or when I pushed to rescind the law that allowed only statues of dead monarchs or prime ministers who were nation builders to be on Parliament Hill, little did I know the national impact it would have. Little did I know the seeds of positive change that was being planted. Every year for 25 years now, Black History Month has provided people from coast to coast an opportunity to fill important gaps in their learning, gaps of knowledge, to tell a more robust, more complete, more worthy story of the history of Canada. And today, the famous 5 statue on Parliament Hill is a signal of the 5 women who have become, that statue has become the most visited statue on Parliament Hill. I hope Gandhi would see this as transformational. His dream of a safe world stressed the emancipation of women. But were he to look around today, he would see that there has been a global nonviolent awareness that is a catalyst for much change. There is hardly any country where some activities have not happened along his principles and nonviolent beliefs. Today, Gandhi is remembered for his passionate adherence to the practice of nonviolence and his supreme humanism in every corner of the world. In 2018, I was humbled to receive the Thakur Gandhi Visiting Scholar Award at Simon Fraser University for my work in advancing the rights of women. I will end by paraphrasing to you what I said to them. Ultimately, Mahatma Gandhi's goal was simply to bring about a better world. Individual and collectively, we have the power to continue his work. Let's each do our best in our own sphere of endeavor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Augustine. Those were wonderful, inspirational conversations. So I have collected a few questions that have been posted on the YouTube chat, and then some folks have emailed me. So I'm going to pose those questions, and please feel free to respond to whichever one you think you would like to. Let me just see here my email. So one question is, in view of the Black Lives Matter and the connection between Gandhi and the civil rights leaders, how do you suggest we can revive that history and learn from it, both in the context of Canada and the United States? So in view of the Black Lives Matter and the connection between Gandhi and the civil rights leaders, how can we revive that history and learn from it? And I think sort of, Reverend Lawson, you gestured to it, but perhaps if either of you wanted to share some more thoughts for our audience.
Well, one of the ways this can happen is recovering nonviolent history. The notion of nonviolence does not come from Gandhi. It is Gandhi who pulled it to the forefront and introduced it into the struggle for independence of India, also justice for the immigrant people in South Africa. So in more than one way, he introduced it, brought it to bear, but it is an ancient philosophy, an ancient methodology. And so it's a history that's been excluded from the history books. So one of the major ways that it can be is to recover the nonviolent history of our own countries. And it's very present in the past. The first strike, for an example, was 1170 in Egypt. That is 3,370 years ago in Egypt. The first civil disobedience campaign might have been as old as that or older. Might have been 4,000 years old. It is described in the Hebrew Bible, chapter 1 of the book of Exodus, where midwives refused to obey Pharaoh's command, and Pharaoh meant he was the lawman of Egypt. They refused Pharaoh's mandate to see to it that boy babies at birth were going to be stillborn. So that's civil disobedience in the first chapter of the book of Exodus of the Hebrew Bible. So it's a very ancient methodology, very ancient philosophy. But as shaped by Western civilization, it has been left out. So we need, in Canada and United States, some histories of our country that represent the nonviolent spirit and nonviolent action and nonviolent political change.
Thank you, Dr. Augustine. Did you want to add anything? You have about 4 or 5 questions, and then,
Mm-hmm. Well, I always step back for the historian. And since we've had Dr. Lawson coming all the way from Los Angeles, in true Canadian spirit, I acquiesce to you. But again, in Canada, how we see the issue of nonviolence working, and the fact that we were able to use that as a method to get to have changes made, especially social changes. The fact that, and again, it goes back to the old saying that you can catch more with sugar and honey than you can with using other methods. Mm-hmm. And the issue of nonviolence speaks to the fact that we need to get to know the perpetrator. We need to know the reason why, and a lot is based on present social, psychological thinking in terms of putting yourself in the place of the other. And going back to what Dr. Lawson mentioned earlier, the issue of the Christian teaching, not the eye for an eye or tooth for a tooth, but it's really understanding the source of where the conflict is and how one can approach that. So again, in present day Canada, we see a lot of this nonviolent action and philosophy working for better for us than the issue of conflict and going after the oppressor rather than going with love and understanding and the self, and giving the I messages and showing the historical things that have created for peoples, whether they're Aboriginal or First Nations people, when we can show the injustices and we can show what has occurred and why we need to remedy this. And we're working for a civil society. And I keep saying all the time, Canada is a work in progress. And all of us are engaged in this work in progress, building what one of our prime minister years ago talked about as a just society. And how can we work towards this just society?
Yes, I agree with that as well. I don't want to, no, let me start over. One of the problems, however, is like in the United States. The revolutionary movement that produced the United States of America was by and large a nonviolent revolution because, among other things, the 13 colonies insisted that human life is noble and we can govern ourselves. We do not need King George. We do not need a king in England to go. We can govern ourselves. That's an important piece of our history that needs to be recovered. Then, in the pre-revolutionary period before the war, we in the United States think it was the Revolutionary War that broke us away from England. It was not. It was the refusal to pay taxes. It was the many petitions to England that said, you are mistreating us and we want decency. It was the assertion, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all are created equal. So a recovery of nonviolent history means that we need to insist that our history books come up with the whole truth and not the half-truth that the United States' 13 colonies broke away primarily because of a Revolutionary War, which is not what happened at all. The war was given credit for one of the most organized and structured and creative nonviolent movements ever in history. Refusal to pay taxes. Refusal to stamp official papers with the British Crown. The Boston Tea Party. A whole range. Women that organized sewing classes in order to not buy British goods and create their own. So it was a massive, that's in none of our history. I had to learn that after high school and after college almost from my reading and study of specific events. So I think every country, think Canada and the United States, needs a major movement to recover the soul force history. Most of all, our forebears in both Canada and the United States reached a conclusion about the efficacy of freedom for all, justice for all. That needs to become the emphasis of the study of our past. So I agree completely.
So McMaster has work to do.
Yeah.
We all have work to do. We're getting there.
We have a huge amount of work to do.
Absolutely. And we are sort of...
Our standard of living in both Canada and the United States is a consequence of the hundreds and thousands and 10,000s of strikes and labor conflicts in the 20th century that produced what one can call the Bill of Rights for working families. And that's what's been forgotten in the United States, and is why we have 140 million of our fellow citizens who are struggling just to keep bread on the table, which is abominable. But to learn and cover that history is one way that we will increase the appreciation for an ancient truth. We may say that it's in religious scripture and in poetic literature, the notion of not for an eye, but to love the enemy. Well, but that's an ancient principle that is true today as when it was first presented in all sorts of poetry and literature of our human past. It's even true. It is even truer today, because the reality is, if our world allows itself to continue to be organized as under the aegis of Western civilization, there is a good chance that we will extinguish life as we know it on this Mother Earth of ours. Many changes has to take place, and we have to face up to this. I have been deeply troubled in the last 2, 3, 4 years with the fact that my country, the United States of America, now has 6,000 troops on the continent of Africa in 43 countries. The future for that presence of 6,000 troops now means it'll be 10,000 in 2 or 3 years, and 15,000 and 20,000, and military bases and air bases. Well, that means my country's policy, international, is to turn Africa into the violence of Libya, Syria, Middle East, Lebanon, Israel, Central Asia. That's the future. Well, how will some 60 million black people in the United States respond to our government's behavior of making Africa the growing place for, in our words, resisting terrorism, where in fact we are, my government is the major terrorist in a people who've been long ignored, and where the nations of Africa have not had a chance whatsoever to turn themselves away from the influence of Western civilization in terms of our worst, to allow them to develop the governments they can best develop for the benefits of their people.
Thank you. So we have number of questions, but I think we can take only 3 more. So the next question is something that Dr. Augustine, you touched upon in terms of the recent claims or sort of the recent criticism that Gandhi is a racist, particularly for using derogatory racist language to describe Black Africans. So Reverend Lawson, you've studied Gandhi closely, and you talked about Gandhi's influence in terms of Martin Luther King, your own work. So how do you respond to that? That because we are willing to forgive Gandhi for using derogatory racist language towards Black Africans, but we are not as forgiving when it comes to other political leaders, say prime ministers of Canada, etc. So what's your response to that?
I think the charge of racism is not a charge that can be substantiated. I don't know how many books by Gandhi himself that I've read, but I have not read racist language in them at all. Colonialism and racism is one of the things he began to fight way back before the 1920s in Africa, and with his anti-caste positions and his equality of women positions in the 20s. He was way ahead of his time. The second thing I would say is that I think this charge comes from enemies of humanity. I would like to know where the money is coming from and who started that kind of complaint. If he was a racist, then African National Congress would never have happened. African National Congress organized itself now over 100 years ago, modeled after Gandhi's resistance in South Africa over the issue of the mistreatment of immigrants, including their adoption of nonviolence as a major way by which they're going to bring about the change. So why would the African peoples adopt African National Congress? Kwame Nkrumah was mentioned. He adopted Gandhian nonviolence. Kenneth, these men, some of whom I met in the 60s and 70s, adopted nonviolent struggle. What Kwame Nkrumah called positive action was his way of talking about nonviolent struggle. So why would that have gone on if Gandhi were a racist? And what I say most about Gandhi is that he sought all his life to get rid of those things in his own life that reflected less than a human posture, less than love, less than truth and compassion, that like all the rest of us, he tried to be transformed personally. So even if there are incidents in the past that one can uncover, which I have not done, I have to admit, the charge of his racism is really the charge of the white supremacist. It's similar to the charge of the Nazi, the charge of the white supremacist.
So the next question is for Dr. Augustine primarily. What advice do you have for young people today in 2020 who are turning more towards activism, engagement, and seeking opportunities to contribute to positive social change?
This is an excellent question. And it's a question that I ask all the time as I associate and speak with young people. At the same time, I think it's important that young people read. Notice how Dr. Lawson was able to put some principles together and to see some kind of a track. And I think it's important for young people to do that kind of civic engagement, to understand the history, to understand what is, I know everybody's looking at what is trending, but to look at those issues that are important for them as they develop their activism skills or their advocacy skills. Because oftentimes, and I think I can leave out the word oftentimes, those issues are not really taught in our school system, in our high school curriculum, or any place where there are opportunities given to young people to reflect, to know what activism is, and to know how they can move, not only individually, but move with others to move things forward. And so if they are supporters of the Black Lives Matter, they need to know what it is that's on the table, what issues are being followed, who has gone that path before, what changes have been made. There are some goals that must be kind of, put ahead of them, and work with others to make the change that is necessary. There is a school, as you mentioned earlier in my bio in Brampton, where they operate on what is called the SAIL principles. Everything they do in the school is pointing to the issue of activism, the issue of service, activism, innovation, and leadership. And each lesson they learn, how can they in turn pull from it service, activism, leading to developing their leadership skills. And I say to young people, read, read, read. Mm-hmm. And as you read, also know that the old African saying that if lions had their own interpreters, the tale of the hunt will be completely different. Who is doing the writing? What is the perspective? And again, going back to all that we've been talking about, how can you see it from the perspective? So for example, the issue about whether racist language was, etc. One should be able to say, I read the book and in page so-and-so and in whatever, and the context is so-and-so, because I think that context is so important. when it was written, who, what the interpretation was at the time, what was the thinking at the time, how did that individual behave in other avenues, etc.
Thank you. We'll take two more questions. I know you're getting tired. Two more, and then I'll do my thank you. So this question is to Reverend Lawson. How do you see the slow death of liberal or progressive churches affecting the future of progressive movements and civil rights? How do you see the slow death of liberal or progressive churches?
The slow death.
Slow death, yes. That's the question. How do you see the slow death of liberal or progressive churches affecting the future of progressive movements and civil rights?
No. Well, what? Yeah, it's a wonderful question. What Dr. Augustine has talked about in terms of personal responsibility and the work of young people is critical, and the personal journey, the personal acceptance rather, of the gift of life and the cultivation of that gift with heart and mind and soul and strength, and by caring about the neighbor, is critical for, I think, the journey of every young person, because who they are, what they think themselves to be, whether they see their gift of life as a miracle and a wonder and a mystery, yet with great capacities for courage and contribution, is very important to what kind of life they're going to live. I think Christianity itself has serious problems in the 20th century because Christianity has been too dominated by religion as doctrine rather than religion as spirit and life. So I happen to think that the demise of Christianity in many ways is a consequence of this broad teaching of dogma rather than of, for an example, the life of Jesus. There are many examples this I could give. So my hope is that a number of denominations that have done some remarkable changes in their midst will become more apparent in their outreach and the way in which they themselves teach the religion and practice the religion. That will be an important bearing for the 21st century. I don't think, well, I'll stop there.
Final question. We have lots more.
The religious option is not a dead option. and Stephen Hawkins, the great cosmologist, astrophysicist from Great Britain, who died a couple of years ago, saying that science will take the place of God. I think that's probably a nonsensical. It's a pretty arrogant statement. We will have the mind of God, then therefore we will not need God. Well, I can't foresee a time where we human beings will think that the universe is thoroughly penetrated by our character, by our knowledge, and by our behavior.
What we need is more pastors like you, Reverend Lawson. That's what's missing in our lives. So the final question, there are just so many, so I apologize to the audience. I can't get to all of them. Our guests have stayed with us long enough. But the final question here, which sort of, brings us, I think, in a good ending, where the person is asking that we've all gathered together on a Saturday evening, and that tells us where our hearts and thoughts are. How do we get the message beyond our own echo chambers? And that's a great question. I think, like, how do we engage others who are not quite where we are? How do we engage with difference? How do we engage with others who are in different spaces in life? How do we go beyond, how do we bridge that difference? So You have both have done wonderful work, and you both are an inspiration to us. So some final thoughts on that, like how do we engage with difference and reach out to those beyond our echo chambers?
Well, I'll jump in and then I'll let the pastor answer this. My motto is you live by example. And this is so crucial, maybe because I came through education. You know, you live by example. And your life is sometimes, and there's an old saying, that your life might be the only disciple or the only example that someone would have in their own lives. And so if you model behaviors, if you bring people along, if you share in non-judgmental ways the principles by which you live, and you model those principles, I think we could widen our circle. Pastor?
Yes, I agree with that too. Also, because Gandhi said, "My life is my example." Is that what he said? Gandhi said
My
something.
life is my message. Yeah.
My message.
My
yes.
life is my message. That's the word I couldn't see. My life is my message. So that's a very, very important thing. But there is a tactic of nonviolence by which you can build any kind of campaign. I call it the one-on-one tactic, the face-to-face tactic. And I've watched congregations grow on that purpose. And what that represents is that instead of my trying to think that my sermons on Sunday are what my major way, no, major way is I go out and visit a person, and I can do it by phone, but face-to-face, I call it face-to-face one-on-one, and have a series of conversations that encourages that person to launch their own faith, life, love journey, to take as critical their own homework. Now, this is inherent in my background in the sports field. A sports team like a football team it's as weak as its weakest member. Every member has to do their work. They're hard-headed, sweaty practice. They're learning of all the strategies of the game. They're learning each week the strategy of that particular game, their own physical fitness and mental fitness. So if players don't take seriously their day-to-day hard work of learning the game, being fit in every respect, especially mentally, they will not have a good team. So that is the discipline for activism. So a methodology of making that happen is one-on-one. And I introduced that in Los Angeles back in the mid-80s, 1980s, to a small union of less than 4,000 members. That union now has more than 35,000 members.
Wow.
And Los Angeles, which was a very anti-union city, now has a union movement of 800,000 members, over 200 unions. And the one-on-one, the methodology that union picked up, and it became a major methodology for union after union. So we have, we're the second densest union city in the country now, next to New York, and we're still growing because our union is still doing. And I was told the other day by one executive of a union, face to face, we're still using it. It's still the best way to help our union grow. And face-to-face means that you don't go out with a dogma. And as a pastor, I rarely asked in the last 30 or 40 years anyone to join my church. I rather encourage them to talk about where they were in life, where they hope to be, what their visions and dreams were, and help them then to work on that.
Thank you.
It's a good tactic.
Good tactic to be open. Yes, exactly. The openness of spirit, right? The capaciousness of spirit. Thank you so much. This has been absolutely wonderful. So on behalf of McMaster University, I would like to thank you our esteemed guests for your inspiring and passionate reflections, for historicizing the Black Lives Movement for us, for contextualizing the nonviolence movement for us, and sort of asking us to take a better look at our histories and the erasures and absences in our histories that both of you talked about, as well as for the continued work that you both have been doing to improve the lives of others and fight for social justice. So thank you so much for everything that you've done, and for being, like Gandhi, your life is your message, and trying to sort of, keep us going. So thank you for everything. I also want to thank the Gandhi Lecture Committee, comprised of Dr. Ashok Dalvi, Dr. Gary Warner, and Dr. Nancy Doubleday. Also want to thank Dr. Rama Singh and the Gandhi Peace Festival Committee for suggesting the speakers. Of course, none of this would have been possible without our donors, who have made this unique community-funded lecture possible. Many of you have joined us today, so thank you, and we look forward to your continued support for the Center for Peace Studies and the Peace Studies program. Finally, I would like to thank our Dean, Dr. Swet, for joining us today, our media specialist, Collins Rande, for his support behind the scenes with recording and live streaming the event, our Peace Study staff, Aurelia Gatto, for creating the event poster. Thank you, everyone who joined us on the live stream today. Thank you for supporting the critical work of the humanities and the university in offering a forum for engagement with both local and global issues as a public responsibility. Thank you all, and I look forward to greeting you in person at the Gandhi Lecture next fall. So thank you, everyone. Our event ends here today. So thank you, Reverend Lawson and Dr. Augustine. This was just fabulous. I'm so glad that you were able to join us.
My privilege to be with you and to be with Dr. Augustine.
Thank you.
Wish you all
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, best wishes.
Take care and stay well.
Thank you.